I watched the DEA agents swarm through my sister's pristine office from across the parking lot, and for the first time in 2 lifetimes, I smiled. Dr. Marlo Chen. An agent appeared at my own office door. I'd been expecting him. We need to ask you some questions about prescription irregularities tied to your DEA registration number. Of course, I said, standing calmly. I've been expecting you. In fact, I have documentation you'll want to see. The agent's eyebrows rose slightly, but he nodded. Through the window, I could see my sister Vivian being led out in handcuffs, her face a mask of confused rage. She was scanning the parking lot looking for me, probably wondering why I wasn't in handcuffs too. She had no idea that I'd died once already because of her schemes, that I'd lived through the horror of being arrested. Losing my medical license, serving 3 years in federal prison for prescription fraud I didn't commit, and dying of a stress-induced heart attack at 42. Alone, broken, and convinced I'd somehow failed to notice my own corruption. But I'd woken up on my 35th birthday, 7 years in the past, with all my memories intact and one burning purpose: make sure Vivian paid for what she did. Or rather, what she was about to do. Let me back up. The first time around, I hadn't noticed anything wrong until it was too late. I was Dr. Marlo Chen, a family medicine physician with a small but thriving practice in Portland, Oregon. I'd worked my ass off to get there. First-generation Chinese American, full scholarship to college, medical school loans I was still paying off at 35. My practice was my baby. I knew every patient by name, remembered their kids' birthdays, stayed late to fit in worried mothers who couldn't get off work during regular hours. Vivian was my older sister by 3 years. She'd always been the golden child, beautiful, charming, effortlessly popular. Where I was awkward and bookish, she glided through life collecting admirers. She'd gone into pharmaceutical sales after getting a business degree, and she was good at it. Really good. 6-figure income, designer clothes, a penthouse apartment in the Pearl District. We'd never been close, but we were family. When she asked if she could list me as a reference for a new position at a major pharmaceutical company, I'd said yes without hesitation. When she asked to take me to lunch once a month to stay connected, I was touched. Vivian had never shown much interest in my life before. I was so fucking stupid. Those lunches became a routine. She'd pick me up from my office, we'd go to some trendy restaurant she loved, she'd ask about my practice. How was business? Was I keeping up with the patient load? Did I have help with the administrative work? I'd complain about my receptionist, Donna, who was sweet but disorganized, about how I really needed to hire someone to help with billing and insurance coding. But I couldn't afford it yet. About how I sometimes fell behind on paperwork because I prioritized patient care over administrative tasks. Vivian listened with such sisterly concern. She even offered to help me organize my office systems a few times. I'd let her, grateful for the attention, for feeling like we were finally building an adult-sibling relationship. She was cataloging every weakness in my security, every gap in my oversight, every moment when my office was vulnerable. 6 months into our sisterly bonding, Vivian started using my DEA registration number to write fraudulent prescriptions. DEA numbers are critical for physicians. They're what allow us to prescribe controlled substances, painkillers, ADHD medications, anxiety medications, anything with abuse potential. Every doctor who prescribes these medications has a unique DEA number, and it's tracked closely by the federal government. Pharmacies verify the number against the physician's license. The DEA monitors prescribing patterns for red flags. It's a serious system. And Vivian had cracked it wide open. She had access to everything she needed. During those helpful office organization sessions, she'd photographed my DEA certificate, my medical license, my signature on prescription pads. She'd befriended Donna, bringing her expensive coffee and pastries, learning our systems, our routines. She knew when I did hospital rounds, when I took my lunch breaks, when the office was empty except for Donna, who often stepped out to grab food or run errands. Vivian created a shadow version of my practice. She ordered prescription pads printed with my information. She had a stamp made with my signature. And she started writing prescriptions, hundreds of them, for oxycodone, Adderall, Xanax, fentanyl patches. She had a network of patients, addicts, and dealers who would fill these prescriptions at pharmacies across 3 states, then sell the pills on the street. The genius of her scheme was the volume. She didn't write huge quantities that would immediately trigger red flags. She wrote realistic amounts, spread across multiple pharmacies using different patient names. The pattern looked like a busy doctor with a diverse patient population, perhaps a bit more liberal with pain management than most, but not wildly outside the norm. For a while, the first time around, the DEA had noticed the irregularities after about 18 months. My prescribing pattern showed a sudden spike in controlled substances that didn't match my patient demographics. When they cross-referenced the patient names on the prescriptions with my actual patient database, they found dozens of people I'd never treated. The raid had come on a Tuesday morning. 6 agents stormed into my office while I was examining a patient. They seized my computers, my files, from my prescription pads. They arrested me in front of my terrified patient, a sweet elderly woman with diabetes who'd been seeing me for 5 years. I'd been completely blindsided. I'd insisted there was a mistake, that I'd never written those prescriptions, but my DEA number was on every single one. My signature was on them, and I couldn't explain how someone else would have access to that information. The investigators had been sympathetic at first, entertaining the possibility that someone had stolen my identity, but the evidence kept mounting against me. Some of the prescriptions had been written during times when I was supposedly in my office. Donna confirmed I'd been there those days. The prescription pads were identical to mine, down to the watermark. Some had even been found in my office during the raid, hidden in the back of a filing cabinet I rarely used. Vivian had planted them there. Of course she had. My lawyer had been expensive and useless. The prosecutor painted me as a corrupt doctor who'd gotten greedy, supplementing my income by feeding the opioid epidemic. The jury had convicted me on 15 counts of illegal distribution of controlled substances. I got sentenced to 5 years in federal prison, though I served only 3 with good behavior. My medical license was revoked, my practice dissolved, my reputation was destroyed. And through it all, Vivian had been the picture of devastated sisterly support. She'd come to the trial every day, crying in the gallery, telling reporters how shocked she was, how she'd never suspected her brilliant sister could fall into such darkness. She'd visited me in prison once a month, bringing photos of the family, telling me how much everyone missed me. I'd been grateful for her loyalty. After I got out, I was unemployable. Ex-con, ex-doctor with federal drug charges on my record. I worked retail jobs, delivery gigs, anything I could get. I lived in a studio apartment that smelled like mildew. I developed high blood pressure, anxiety, insomnia. My hair went gray. I looked 20 years older than I was. Vivian's career, meanwhile, had flourished. She'd been promoted twice during my imprisonment, each time to a more lucrative position. She'd bought a house in the West Hills with a view of Mount Hood. She'd gotten married to a software executive and had 2 perfect children. At 42, I had a massive heart attack in my apartment. I was alone. By the time anyone found me, I'd been dead for 2 days. And then I woke up. 7 years earlier, my 35th birthday. I woke up gasping, clutching at my chest, expecting pain that wasn't there. I was in my old apartment. The nice 1-bedroom I'd had before everything fell apart. Sunlight streamed through the windows. My cat, Mr. Darcy, who died while I was in prison, was curled up at the foot of my bed, very much alive. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands. The date confirmed it. 7 years in the past. 6 months before Vivian would start her scheme. I sat there for 3 hours, processing, testing reality, trying to convince myself I was hallucinating, having a mental breakdown, something rational. But I knew things I couldn't possibly know if this were just a vivid dream or delusion. I knew the password to my old email account, the one I'd changed 5 years ago in this timeline. I knew that Mrs. Patterson, one of my patients, would be diagnosed with breast cancer in 3 months. I knew that Donna would quit next year to move to Arizona with her boyfriend. I knew that my sister was about to destroy my life. The rage came slowly, then all at once, a white-hot fury that made my hands shake and my vision blur. Vivian had let me go to prison. She'd visited me behind glass barriers, crying crocodile tears, while she lived in luxury bought with money from the addiction and misery she'd created. She'd watched me lose everything and never confessed, never even hinted at guilt. She'd let me die thinking I was somehow responsible, that I'd been too careless, too trusting, that my own incompetence had led to my downfall. My first instinct was to confront her immediately, to scream at her, to warn her I knew what she was planning, to threaten her with exposure. But I stopped myself. I was a doctor. I was trained to diagnose before treating. If I confronted Vivian now, before she'd done anything, I had no proof. She'd deny everything. She might even accelerate her plans or change tactics entirely. And I'd be the one who looked crazy, accusing my innocent sister of a conspiracy that hadn't happened yet. No, I needed to be smarter than that. I needed to let Vivian believe she was succeeding, while I built an ironclad case against her. I needed to document everything, gather evidence, and make sure that when she finally got caught, there would be no possibility of her blaming me. I needed to beat her at her own game. The first thing I did was secure my DEA number and prescription pads. I called a security consultant that same week, a retired FBI agent who specialized in medical office security. I told him I'd read about prescription fraud schemes and wanted to make sure my practice was protected. He'd been impressed by my proactive approach. We installed a proper safe in my office for prescription pads and DEA documentation. I implemented a sign-out system where every single prescription pad was numbered and tracked. I installed security cameras, not just in the waiting room, but in my office, the storage areas, everywhere except the exam rooms. Patient privacy laws. I hired a part-time office manager, a sharp-eyed former nurse named Patricia who took no shit and ran the administrative side like a military operation. Donna was sweet, but ultimately too trusting. Patricia was exactly what I needed. When Vivian called to schedule our first reconnection lunch, I was ready. "Marlo," she'd sounded so warm on the phone, "I've been thinking about you. We should grab lunch sometime. I feel like we lost touch after college, and we're adults now. We should be close." "That sounds lovely," I said, my voice steady despite the rage churning in my gut. "I'd like that." We set a date for the following week. I showed up with a wire. It wasn't a police wire. I couldn't go to the authorities yet, not without evidence of an actual crime, but I'd bought a high-quality digital recorder, the kind journalists used, small enough to hide in my purse. I recorded every single conversation we had from that point forward. That first lunch, Vivian had been charming, asking about my practice with what seemed like genuine interest. I played my role perfectly, the slightly overwhelmed small business owner, struggling with administrative tasks, grateful for her attention. "You know," she'd said, sipping her overpriced kombucha, "I'm really good with organizational systems. It's part of my job, streamlining processes. If you ever want help sorting out your office flow, I'd be happy to take a look." "Really? That would be amazing," I said, watching her over my own drink. "I'm drowning in paperwork sometimes." She'd smiled. "What are sisters for?" What indeed? Over the next few months, I let Vivian into my office exactly as she'd wanted, but this time, I controlled everything. I'd briefed Patricia on the situation. Not the full truth, not the rebirth, but enough. I told her my sister had a history of boundary issues, and I wanted to make sure nothing sensitive was left accessible when she visited. Patricia had understood immediately. "Some families are complicated," she'd said. "Don't worry, Dr. Chen. Nothing important will be where she can reach it." When Vivian came by to help organize, she found exactly what I wanted her to find. Old prescription pads that I'd carefully marked with invisible UV ink, copies of my DEA certificate, also marked, and a security system that appeared to be much simpler than it actually was. The visible cameras were obvious, perfect for Vivian to avoid. The hidden cameras were state-of-the-art, tucked into smoke detectors and wall outlets, recording everything in high definition. I watched on my phone from the hospital, where I was supposedly doing rounds, as Vivian photographed my documents, as she sweet-talked Donna into taking a break while Vivian just finished filing these charts, as she slipped 2 prescription pads into her purse. The pads I'd numbered and marked specifically for this purpose. "Got you?" I thought. But catching her in the act of stealing the pads wasn't enough. I needed to prove the full scope of her scheme. I needed to catch her writing fraudulent prescriptions, using my identity, building her drug distribution network. So I watched and waited. I'd installed tracking software on the prescription pads, a nearly invisible RFID chip embedded in the paper, the kind used for high-end authentication. Every time one of those pads moved, I knew where it went. Vivian was careful. She didn't start writing prescriptions immediately. She spent weeks setting up her network first, finding her dealers, her addicts, her corrupt pharmacy techs who'd look the other way. She was patient, but I was more patient, because I knew exactly how this ended. The first fraudulent prescription appeared 6 months after our first lunch, exactly on schedule with my previous timeline. A script for 60 oxycodone 30 milligrams pills, filled at a Walgreens in Vancouver, Washington, just across the state line. Patient name, Robert Morrison, a person I'd never met. My tracking software pinged. I downloaded the pharmacy data, legal for me to access as the prescribing physician of record. I documented everything: the date, time, location, patient name, the fact that this person wasn't in my patient database. Then I did something Vivian wouldn't expect. I called the pharmacy. "Hi, this is Dr. Marlo Chen," I said. "I have a question about a prescription that was filled yesterday under my DEA number. Patient name, Robert Morrison." The pharmacy tech sounded immediately nervous. "Yes, doctor? Is there a problem?" "I'm conducting an internal audit of my prescribing patterns," I said smoothly. "Can you tell me what identification was provided when this prescription was filled?" She gave me the driver's license number. I thanked her and hung up. Then I hired a private investigator. His name was James Yu, a former Portland police detective who'd gone private after taking early retirement. I'd found him through a medical colleague who'd used him to investigate insurance fraud. I told him I suspected prescription fraud, but needed documentation before going to the authorities. "Smart," he'd said. "DEA takes this stuff seriously. But they need solid evidence. You don't want to accuse someone without proof." He had no idea how true that was. James traced Robert Morrison to a studio apartment in a rough part of Vancouver. 43 years old, history of drug possession charges, currently unemployed. James watched him for a week and photographed him selling pills to known dealers. Then, James did something brilliant. He interviewed Morrison under the guise of being an insurance investigator. "I don't know any Dr. Chen," Morrison had said, clearly stoned. "My girl Viv gets me the scripts. I just fill them and give her the pills. She pays me $200 per script." "Viv?" James had asked. "Yeah, Vivian something. Works for a pharma company. She's got the hookup." James had recorded everything. Over the next year, I built my case meticulously. Every fraudulent prescription I documented, every patient I traced, every dealer in Vivian's network I cataloged. I created a shadow database of her entire operation. Dates, times, locations, patient names, prescriptions filled, pills sold. I collected security footage, phone records, financial transactions. James helped me connect the dots, showing how money flowed from the pills to Vivian's accounts. She was smart enough to use an LLC, but James was smarter. I had everything, enough to bury her completely, but I still had to make sure I couldn't be implicated. This was the tricky part. In my previous life, the DEA had assumed I was either directly involved or criminally negligent. I needed to prove I was neither, so I created a paper trail of due diligence. Every month, I conducted internal audits of my prescription practices. I documented them meticulously, showing that my actual prescribing patterns were conservative and appropriate. I sent memos to myself, yes, memos to myself, carefully dated and filed, noting discrepancies in DEA database queries, asking Patricia to help me out, figure out why the system shows prescriptions I don't remember writing. I attended DEA-sponsored seminars on prescription fraud prevention. I joined a medical board task force on opioid abuse. I gave a presentation at a regional medical conference about securing DEA credentials. I became the poster child for prescription fraud awareness. And all the while, Vivian's operation expanded. She was writing dozens of prescriptions a week now, moving serious volume. Her dealers covered 3 states. She was making roughly $50,000 a month tax-free. She thought she was untouchable. At our monthly lunches, she'd talk about her career success, her beautiful home, her perfect life. She'd ask how my little practice was doing, with just a hint of condescension in her voice. "Still struggling with the administrative stuff?" She'd ask sweetly. "Getting better," I'd say. "I hired a good office manager. She's really tightened things up." Vivian's smile would flicker, just slightly. She'd started to notice that her access to my office was more restricted, that Donna was less chatty, more professional. I had given Donna a raise and sent her to a medical administration training course. She'd come back more confident and competent. That the disorganized filing system had been completely overhauled. But by then it was too late. She'd already committed to her scheme. Her network was established. Her dealers were dependent on the supply. She couldn't stop without risking her entire operation. She was trapped, and she didn't even know it. I gave her 18 months, the same amount of time it had taken in my previous life for the DEA to notice the irregularities. But this time, I didn't wait for them to notice. I made sure they couldn't miss it. I'd been in contact with a DEA diversion investigator, a woman named Special Agent Diana Reeves, who specialized in prescription fraud cases. I'd met her at one of those seminars I'd attended, and we'd developed a professional rapport. I'd asked her smart questions about red flags, about how to protect my practice, about what to do if I ever suspected fraud. She'd given me her card. "If you ever see something suspicious, call me directly." Well, we take this seriously. I'd held onto that card for a year and a half, waiting for the perfect moment. Finally, I made the call. "Agent Reeves, this is Dr. Marlo Chen. We met at the Portland Diversion Seminar last year. I think I have a problem." She'd been at my office within 2 hours. I showed her everything. The internal audits showing discrepancies, the security footage of Vivian photographing my documents and stealing prescription pads, the tracking data showing those specific pads being used to write fraudulent scripts, the UV markings that matched. "I've been trying to figure this out on my own," I told her, letting my voice shake slightly. I couldn't believe my own sister would do this, so I wanted to be absolutely sure before I accused her. "But the evidence is overwhelming." Agent Reeves had looked at me with something like awe. "Dr. Chen, this is the most thoroughly documented case of prescription fraud I've ever seen. Most physicians don't even notice until we raid their offices." "I almost didn't notice," I lied, "but I attended your seminar and you talked about the importance of monitoring our own prescribing patterns. When I started tracking mine, I realized something was very wrong." She'd spent 6 hours in my office that day, going through everything. She'd brought in 2 other agents. They'd interviewed Patricia, who'd confirmed my story about implementing security measures and conducting audits. They'd interviewed Donna, who reluctantly admitted that Vivian had been very friendly, very interested in the office systems, and had definitely been alone in the office a few times. "Why didn't you mention this before?" Agent Reeves had asked Donna. Donna had started crying. "I didn't think it mattered. She's Dr. Chen's sister. I thought she was just helping out." I'd put a comforting hand on Donna's shoulder. "It's not your fault," I said gently. "She manipulated both of us." The investigation moved quickly after that. The DEA moved on Vivian's network simultaneously, coordinated raids across 3 states, hitting the dealers and the corrupt pharmacy techs at the same time they hit Vivian. They'd wanted to raid my office too, for appearances, to compare my actual prescription pads and security systems against the fraudulent ones, to make sure my story held up. I'd agreed immediately. "Whatever you need to do. I want this resolved," which is how I ended up watching through my window as Vivian got arrested. While I calmly provided documentation to the agents in my own office, Agent Reeves sat across from me at my desk, reviewing the files I'd prepared. "You've essentially done our job for us," she said. "This is incredibly comprehensive." "I'm a doctor," I said. "I'm trained to document everything. And I couldn't let someone use my credentials to fuel the opioid epidemic. People are dying from this stuff." She'd nodded approvingly. "You're going to have to testify, you know. Your sister's lawyer will try to implicate you, to suggest you were part of it." "I understand. I have nothing to hide." And I didn't. My actual prescribing records were pristine. My patient database was clean. Every controlled substance prescription I'd written in the past year and a half was for legitimate patients with documented medical need. Appropriate quantities, proper monitoring. I'd been extra careful, knowing this day would come. Vivian's lawyer did try to throw me under the bus. He argued that I must have known what was happening, that I was either complicit or criminally negligent, that no one could have such comprehensive evidence unless they were involved. But the jury didn't buy it. They saw the security footage of Vivian stealing the prescription pads. They heard the recorded testimony from her dealers naming her specifically. They saw the financial records showing money flowing into her accounts. They heard from Agent Reeves about how I'd voluntarily come forward, about how my cooperation had made their case possible. And they heard me testify about how I'd idolized my older sister, how I'd been thrilled when she wanted to reconnect as adults, how devastating it was to realize she'd been using me. I cried on the stand. Real tears. Because even though I hated Vivian for what she'd done in my previous life, there was a part of me that mourned what we could have been. Sisters who actually loved each other. Family. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. Guilty on all counts. Vivian got 8 years in federal prison. Her medical fraud, combined with the distribution network and the sheer volume of pills she'd moved, made her sentence longer than mine had been in the previous timeline. She lost everything. Her job, her house, her husband, who filed for divorce immediately, her social standing. Her mugshot made the local news. Articles called her a prescription drug queen pin and a corrupt pharmaceutical insider. I made sure to visit her once after the sentencing, the same prison where I'd served my time in the other life, the same visiting room. She'd looked at me through the glass with pure hatred. "You set me up," she'd hissed. "You fucking set me up." "No," I said calmly. "You set yourself up. You stole my DEA number. You committed fraud. You distributed drugs. I just made sure you got caught." "Why?" She'd been crying, mascara running down her face. "We're sisters. How could you do this to me?" I'd leaned forward, my voice low and cold. "You would have let me take the fall for this. You would have watched me lose everything and never said a word. Don't talk to me about being sisters." "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do." I'd stood up. "Enjoy the next 8 years, Vivian." "I know I will." I'd walked out and never looked back. The aftermath was better than I could have imagined. My practice not only survived, it thrived. The publicity around the case actually helped. I was featured in medical journals as an example of ethical practice and fraud prevention. I gave lectures at medical schools about protecting DEA credentials. The Oregon Medical Board asked me to join their ethics committee. Patients appreciated my diligence. My practice grew. I hired 2 associate physicians and moved to a larger office. I paid off my medical school loans 5 years early. I started dating, something I'd never prioritized in my previous life. I met a wonderful man named David, an architect who made me laugh and didn't mind that I sometimes worked late. We got married 3 years after Vivian's conviction. I bought a house in the suburbs with a yard for Mr. Darcy to explore. He lived to be 18 this time, happy and spoiled. I took actual vacations. I joined a book club. I learned to make pottery, badly but joyfully. I lived the life I should have had the first time around. My parents struggled with what Vivian had done. They'd initially tried to pressure me to show mercy, to ask for a reduced sentence, to forgive. "She's your sister," my mother had said, crying. "She tried to destroy me," I'd replied. "She would have let me go to prison in her place. I won't apologize for protecting myself." Eventually, they'd accepted it. They'd seen the evidence. They couldn't deny what Vivian had done. I stayed in touch with Agent Reeves. She told me that my case had become a training example at the DEA, how physicians should monitor their own practices, how to recognize and prevent fraud, how to cooperate with investigations. "You probably saved lives," she'd told me once. "The pills your sister was moving, those end up killing people. Overdoses, accidents, addictions spiraling out of control. You stopped that." It was good to hear, but honestly, I hadn't done it to save strangers. I'd done it for me, for the life Vivian had stolen from me in another timeline, for the justice I'd been denied when I died alone and disgraced. Sometimes I wondered if I should feel guilty about how thoroughly I'd destroyed Vivian's life, if setting her up so completely, documenting her crimes with such cold precision made me as bad as her. But then I'd remember lying on that apartment floor, my heart seizing knowing I was dying alone because of what she'd done to me. I'd remember the prison guards, the strip searches, the 3 years of my life stolen. I'd remember watching Mrs. Patterson, my patient, recoil from me in the courtroom like I was a monster. Vivian had made her choices. I'd just made sure she faced the consequences. And I'd made different choices. I'd protected people. I'd built a good life. I'd loved and been loved. If that made me ruthless, so be it. I'd died once already. I wasn't going to waste my second chance on forgiveness for someone who'd never deserved it. 7 years after Vivian's conviction, I got a letter from her. She was up for parole. She wanted me to write a letter of support, vouching for her rehabilitation, her remorse, her readiness to rejoin society. I read it 3 times, then fed it through my office shredder. The parole board denied her application. She'd serve her full sentence. I slept well that night. On my 42nd birthday, the age I'd been when I died in the previous timeline, I threw myself a party. A big one, with all my friends, my colleagues, my patients who'd become friends. David had rented out a restaurant, decorated with photos from our years together. Patricia was there, retired now, but still sharp as ever. She'd brought me a gift, a framed photo of a newspaper headline from the trial. "Local doctor helps bust prescription fraud ring." "You earned this," she said, hugging me. "You protected your practice and your integrity." I looked at the photo and smiled. In another life, the headline about me had been very different. "Doctor sentenced in opioid distribution scheme." But not in this life. Never in this life. Mr. Darcy wound around my ankles, purring. David wrapped an arm around my waist. My friends laughed and talked around me. The restaurant was warm and bright. I'd been given a second chance, and I'd used it to build something real. Something good. Something that couldn't be taken away. As for Vivian, she still had 6 months left on her sentence. I'd heard through my mother that she'd aged poorly in prison, that her hair was gray, her face lined with bitterness, that she spent her days in the prison library reading medical journals, perhaps fantasizing about the career she could have had if she'd made different choices. I didn't feel sorry for her. I felt free. Because the best revenge wasn't just seeing her punished. It was living well. It was building the life she'd tried to steal from me and making it even better than before. It was waking up every morning in a home I loved, next to a man I loved, doing work that mattered, surrounded by people who valued me. It was being 42 years old and thriving, while she counted down the days in a federal prison cell. The DEA raid had happened exactly as I'd planned it. Both our offices had been raided, just like the title of my story had promised. But only one of us had emerged free. I raised my glass of champagne, looking around at all the people who'd made this second life worth living. "Thank you all for being here," I said. "Thank you for being part of my journey." They cheered and clinked glasses, not knowing the full truth of what I meant. That this was more than a birthday celebration. It was a victory lap for a war they'd never known I was fighting. I'd died once, betrayed and destroyed by my own sister, but I'd been reborn, and this time, I'd won.